In the scriptural justice system, the highest authority, the Most High Yah, is the judge and the jury. The seed of Israel are his children. These are their stories. XD Chinatown, New York City day. Detective Sarah Banks and Riley Thompson walk through bustling streets. They pass a small museum exhibit in a storefront window, the Silk Road Ancient Trade Routes. Riley stops, staring at one particular display panel showing a Tang Dynasty painting depicting dark-skinned figures. Riley, wait, is that... Banks. Dark-skinned people in ancient China, yeah. Riley, I thought we were only tracking the transatlantic slave trade. You know, ships, the Americas. That's what Deuteronomy 28:68 says, ships. Deuteronomy 28:68 is specific to being brought back into Egypt bondage by ships. That's the transatlantic trade. But Deuteronomy 28:64 says something else. She pulls out her phone, opens her Bible app, reads aloud, Banks, "And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone." She looks at Riley. All people, from one end of the earth to the other. That's not just the Americas, that's global. And it doesn't say by ships for this verse, just scattered. Everywhere, Riley. So we need to track the scattering to Asia too. Banks, not just Asia, every continent. But we start with the East, because if the Israelites were scattered to China, Japan, Han, Korea, that's a diaspora nobody talks about. She looks back at the Tang Dynasty painting, and we need to find out, were they brought by ships, by land routes, were they sold, were they enslaved, and are they still there? SLT, Special Series Episode 3, East Asia. The Forgotten Diaspora. Act 1, The Evidence of Presence in TSLTD, Conference Room Day. The team is assembled. Banks projects a map of Asia on the screen, highlighting China, Japan, and Korea. Banks. Before we investigate how Israelites or other Africans got to East Asia, we need to establish if they got there. Is there evidence of a black African presence in ancient and medieval China, Japan, and Korea? Chen, I've been researching this for 2 weeks. And yes, there's evidence. Significant evidence. Riley, wait, really? Really? Let me show you. Part 1. China, Kunlun slaves, and the Tang Dynasty. We start with China. Specifically, the Tang Dynasty, 608 into 907 AD. He projects an image of a Tang Dynasty ceramic figurine, clearly depicting a dark-skinned African-featured person. These are called Kunlun slave figurines, found in Tang Dynasty tombs across China. Hundreds of them. Riley, Kunlun slave? Okafor Kunlun was the Chinese term for dark-skinned people from South Asia, Southeast Asia, and East Africa. The term is complex. It sometimes referred to mountains in western China, but by the Tang Dynasty, it primarily meant dark-skinned foreigners. Chen. And these figurines show they were present in significant numbers. Wealthy Chinese families owned them as slaves or servants. Banks, we need sources, documentation. Chen got them. Source 1. Tang Dynasty Historical Texts. Document Taiping Guangji Pingguangji. Extensive records of the Taiping era. Compiled 978 Song Dynasty, but contains Tang Dynasty records. Description. Multiple stories reference Kunlun slaves, Kununu, in Tang Dynasty China. These accounts describe dark-skinned slaves from foreign lands, particularly skilled in certain trades and labor. Specific story. The Kunlun slave, Kunlun Tuan. A tale of a Kunlun slave with exceptional abilities who helps a young scholar. The slave is described as having black skin like lacquer and coming from the southern seas. Source citation. Taiping Guangji, compiled by Li Fang 978 AD. Modern edition Zhonghua Book Company, Beijing 1961. English translation excerpts in Edward H. Schaffer, The Golden Peaches of Samarkand, University of California Press, 1963, pp. 22-23. Discussed in Don J. Wyatt, The Blacks of Pre-Modern China, University of Pennsylvania Press, 2010, p. 34-67. Banks. So Tang Dynasty Chinese texts explicitly mention dark-skinned slaves. What else? Source 2. Archaeological evidence, Tang Dynasty figurines. Okafor, hundreds of ceramic figurines depicting dark-skinned, African-featured people have been found in Tang Dynasty tombs, 618 to 907 AD. She projects images of multiple figurines, clearly showing African features: dark skin in coloured ceramics, full lips, broad noses, coiled hair. These are called black pottery figures or Kunlun slave figures. They've been excavated from elite tombs across China, Chang'an, modern Xi'an, Luoyang, and other Tang Dynasty cities. Physical description: dark glazed pottery, black or dark brown, African facial features, often depicted in servant labour roles, found alongside other tomb goods indicating wealth. Sources: archaeological studies, Tang Dynasty tomb figures, multiple excavation reports, Shanxi Provincial Institute of Archaeology, numerous Tang tombs excavated 1950s present, figurines housed in Shanxi History Museum Xi'an, National Museum of China, Beijing. Academic analysis: Don J. Wyatt, The Blacks of Pre-Modern China, University of Pennsylvania Press, 2010, pp. 68-112. Comprehensive study of Tang Dynasty evidence. Analyzes figurines, texts, and artistic depictions. ISBN 9780812244645. Chen. These aren't isolated finds. We're talking hundreds of figurines across multiple sites. This was a known, established presence. Source 3. Tang Dynasty Poetry and Literature. Ofa Tang Dynasty poets wrote about Kunlun slaves. Let me show you. Poem 1, Du Fu, 712-770 AD, one of China's greatest poets. Poem references to dark-skinned servants in household settings. While Du Fu doesn't have a specific poem dedicated to Kunlun slaves, his contemporary poets do reference them. Poem 2, Jiangji, 766-830, excerpt. Translated: the Kunlun servant pours the wine, his black skin gleaming like polished stone. Source citation: various Tang Dynasty poetry anthologies, discussed in Wyatt, The Blacks of Pre-Modern China, pp. 89-93. Also, Edward H. Schaefer, The Black Man in Tang China, Journal of the American Oriental Society, Volume 85, No. 4, 1965, p. 497-520 Banks. So we have 1. Historical texts explicitly mentioning Kunlun slaves. 2. Archaeological evidence, hundreds of figurines. 3. Poetry referencing dark-skinned servants. This confirms an African dark-skinned presence in Tang Dynasty China. Now the question: where did they come from and how did they get there? How did Africans get to China? Chen. 2 primary routes: Arab slave trade via Indian Ocean and potentially some via land Silk Road routes. Okafor, let me break this down with sources. Route 1, Arab slave trade, Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, China. Okafor. We documented in Season 1, Episode 5, that the Arab slave trade moved millions of Africans via the Indian Ocean between 700 to 1900 AD. The route: 1. East Africa, Zanzibar, Kilwagyu, Arab slavers capture or trade for African captives. 2. Across Indian Ocean, ships transport to Arab ports, Persia, India. 3. From India, Southeast Asia, China, some captives sold onward to Chinese merchants. Chen Tang Dynasty. China had extensive trade with the Arab world, Persia, India, and Southeast Asia. Chinese merchant ships and Arab ships travelled these routes regularly. Source: Edward H. Schaefer, The Golden Peaches of Samarkand, A Study of Tang Exotics, 1963. Description: the Tang capital of Kang was a cosmopolitan city with merchants from across Asia, including Arabs, Persians, Indians, and Southeast Asians. Exotic goods and people flowed into China via maritime trade routes. Among the foreign peoples documented in Tang texts are dark-skinned slaves referred to as Kunlun, brought via southern sea routes. Source site: Edward H. Schaefer, The Golden Peaches of Samarkand, A Study of Tang Exotics, University of California Press, 1963, pp. 19-24, ISBN 9780520054622, available in major university libraries. Okafor. So Africans captured by Arab slavers could be transported across the Indian Ocean, sold in ports in India or Southeast Asia, then sold again to Chinese merchants. Evidence of Arab-Chinese trade connections. Source: Sen, Tansen, Buddhism, Diplomacy and Trade, The Realignment of India-China Relations, 600-1400, 2003. Finding: maritime trade between Arab-Persian merchants and Chinese ports flourished during the Tang and Song dynasties. Canton, Guangzhou, became a major hub for foreign trade with permanent Arab and Persian merchant communities. Among goods traded were luxury items, spices, and slaves. Source citation: Tansen Sen, Buddhism, Diplomacy and Trade, The Realignment of India-China Relations, 600 to 1400, University of Hawaii Press, 2003, pp. 7689, ISBN 978-08248767. Canton. The entry port Chen Guangzhou was the major port for foreign trade in Tang Dynasty China. Arab and Persian merchants lived there in large communities. Source: Chinese historical text, Xin Tangshu, New Book of Tang, compiled 1060 AD. Record: references foreign merchants in Guangzhou bringing exotic goods and peoples from the southern seas and western regions. Source citation: Xin Tangshu, Official Tang Dynasty History, Modern Edition, discussed in Hugh R. Clark, Community Trade and Networks, Southern Fujian Province from the 3rd to 13th century, Cambridge University Press, 1991. Banks. So Africans could arrive in Guangzhou via Arab merchant ships, then be sold into Chinese households. Okafor, exactly. And there's one more critical detail. Castration upon arrival, the Guangzhou practice. Okafor, this is horrific, but documented. Male African slaves arriving in China, particularly Guangzhou, were often castrated before being allowed into the country. Riley. Wait, we covered this in Season 1, Episode 5 with the Arab slave trade. The massive castration operation. Okafor, same practice extended to China. Let me show you the source. Source: Edward H. Schaefer, The Black Man in Tang China, 1965. Quote, there is evidence that black slaves imported into Tang China were castrated, possibly upon arrival at southern ports such as Canton. This practice, similar to that employed in the Islamic world, rendered them safe for service in elite households, particularly in proximity to women. Source citation: Edward H. Schaefer, The Black Man in Tang China, Journal of the American Oriental Society, Vol. 85, No. 4, October Defkimer 1965, 97 to 520, available through JSTOR. .jstore.org/stable5979 banks. So the same brutality documented in the Arab slave trade extended to China, castration as a control mechanism, which fulfills another aspect of the curse: physical mutilation, inability to reproduce, genetic lines cut off. Okafor, and it gets worse. There's evidence this wasn't just Arab traders doing this. Chinese authorities may have mandated it. Tang Dynasty Regulations on Foreign Slaves. Source: Don J. Wyatt, The Blacks of Pre-Modern China, 2010. Finding: Tang Dynasty regulations regarding foreign slaves, particularly those of African origin, likely included restrictions on their movement and reproduction. While direct textual evidence of mandatory castration laws is scarce, the archaeological and literary evidence suggests a systematic practice, possibly enforced by port authorities in Canton. Source citation: Don J. Wyatt, The Blacks of Pre-Modern China, University of Pennsylvania Press, 2010, pp. 102 to 108, ISB 978-08124264 Fangs. So we have 1. Evidence of African presence in Tang Dynasty China, figurines, texts, poetry. 2. Trade routes connecting China to Arab slave networks, Indian Ocean, Southeast Asia, Guangzhou. 3. Documentation of castration practices. 4. Evidence they were enslaved, not free migrants. Now the question, were any of these Africans actually Israelites? Were Kunlun slaves Israelites? Riley. How do we determine if these African slaves in China were from Israelite populations? Okafor, it's difficult because 1. Chinese texts didn't distinguish between different African ethnic groups. They were all Kunlun. 2. No written records from the slaves themselves survive. DNA evidence is nearly impossible. No known burial sites specifically identified as Kunlun slave burials. But we can make educated inferences. Banks. Based on what? Okafor. Based on where the Arab slave trade sourced its captives and when. Arab slave trade sources 700-1400. Okafor. We documented in Season 1 that the Arab slave trade primarily sourced from 1. East Africa, Zanj, modern-day Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique, Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia. These regions had documented Hebraic Israelite populations, Beta Israel in Ethiopia, Lemba in East Southern Africa, other communities. 2. Horn of Africa, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, Beta, Israelites of Ethiopia lived here. 3. Interior Africa via trade networks. Some captives came from further inland via intermediary traders, could include West African populations. Riley. So if the Arab slave trade was sourcing from East Africa, and East Africa had Israelite populations, then statistically some of the people sold to China would have been Israelites. Okafor, that's the logical inference. We can't prove specific individuals, but the probability is high. Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907 AD, overlaps with Arab slave trade peak Chen. The Tang Dynasty period, when Kunlun slaves are most documented, 700s to 800s AD, coincides with the expansion of the Arab slave trade following Islamic conquests. Timeline: 640 to 750 AD, Arab Islamic conquests reach North Africa, expand into East Africa. 700 to 900 AD, Arab slave trade via Indian Ocean accelerates. 700-900 AD, Tang Dynasty. China imports peak numbers of Kunlun slaves, banks. So the timing aligns. Arab slavers are actively raiding East Africa during the same period. Chinese texts document large numbers of African slaves arriving. Deuteronomy 28:64 fulfillment, banks. Let's check the prophecy again. She projects Deuteronomy 28 verse 64 on screen. KJV, and the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. Banks, among all people. Check. China is definitely all people. From one end of the earth to the other. Check. If Israelites are in East Africa and end up in China, that's literally across the known world. Serve other gods, wood and stone. What were Chinese religious practices during the Tang Dynasty? Chen Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, ancestor worship. And yes, wooden and stone idols were common in Buddhist and Taoist temples. Banks. So if Israelites were brought to China as slaves and forced to serve in Buddhist or Taoist households, they'd be serving gods which neither they nor their fathers have known, even wood and stone. The prophecy fits. Research Lab, Day. Riley works with Chen, pulling up more sources. Riley, what about Song Dynasty and later? Did the African presence continue after the Tang Dynasty fell? Yes. Let me show you. Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279 AD, continued African presence. Chen, the Song Dynasty maintained extensive maritime trade with the Arab world, India and Southeast Asia. African slaves continued to arrive via the same routes. Source, Chinese historical text, Lingwai Da, representative answers from the region beyond the passes. Author, Zhou Qiu Chufei, circa 1178 AD. Description, a Song Dynasty geographical and ethnographic work describing foreign peoples and lands. Contains references to dark-skinned peoples from the southern seas and their presence in southern Chinese ports. Quote, translated, the Kunlun people have hair like curled black lace and bodies the colour of ink. They come from beyond the southern seas and serve in households of the wealthy. Source citation, Zhou Lingwai Daida, 1178 AD. Modern edition, Zhonghua Book Company, Beijing, 1999. English translation excerpts in Friedrich Hirth and W. Rockhill, Chaoju Kua, his work on the Chinese and Arab trade in the 12th and 13th centuries, St. Petersburg, 1911, discussed in The Blacks of Pre-Modern China, pp. 145 to 162. Chen. So the presence continued. But by the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644 AD, references declined significantly. Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644 AD, Zheng He's Voyages, Okafor. The Ming Dynasty is fascinating because of Zheng He. Riley, who's Zheng He? Okafor, Chinese Muslim admiral who commanded massive naval expeditions between 1405-1433 AD. His fleet travelled to Southeast Asia, India, Arabia and East Africa. She projects a map showing Zheng He's routes reaching as far as the East African coast. Okaf. His voyages reached Mogadishu, Malindi, and other East African ports. He brought back exotic animals, goods, and people. Source, Louise Levithes. When China Ruled the Seas, The Treasure Fleet of the Dragon Throne, 1405 to 4033, 1994. Description, comprehensive history of Zheng He's voyages. Documents that the fleet brought back people from various regions, including East Africa, as tribute or for display at the Ming court. Quote, among the treasures brought back from East Africa were giraffes, zebras and peoples from the coastal regions. Some of these individuals were presented to the Ming Emperor as exotic tribute. Source citation, Louise Leverthes, When China Ruled the Seas, Simon & Schuster, 1994, pp 102 to 118, 174 to 180n, NIA 780684194335 Banks. So even in the 1400s, Africans were being brought to China, this time directly by Chinese naval expeditions to East Africa. Chen. But after Zheng He's voyages ended, 1433, China turned inward. Maritime trade declined. The African presence seems to have largely disappeared by the 1500s-1600s. What happened to them? Riley. So if hundreds or thousands of Africans, possibly including Israelites, were brought to China over 700 years, 600s to 1400s AD, where are they now? Banks. That's the haunting question. Okafor several possibilities. 1. Assimilation. Without ability to reproduce due to castration, they left no descendants. They died with no genetic legacy. 2. Small populations. Any who weren't castrated and did reproduce may have been absorbed into the Chinese population over generations. 3. Genetic dilution. Even if some descendants exist, after 30 to 40 generations, their African heritage might be genetically undetectable. 4. No written records. Slaves typically didn't leave written records. Their stories died with them. Banks. So they vanished. Scattered to the other end of the earth, served foreign gods, and disappeared from history. Chen, unless there are communities that remember. Modern claims of African Chinese heritage. Chen, there are a few modern communities in southern China that claim African ancestry, but these are highly controversial and not academically verified. Examples. 1. Some communities in Guangdong province claim their darker skin and certain features indicate African heritage, but genetic studies are inconclusive. 2. Folklore in certain southern Chinese villages mentions dark-skinned ancestors from across the seas. Source, Skeptical Analysis, Don J. Wyatt, The Blacks of Pre-Modern China, 2010. Assessment. While intriguing, modern claims of African Chinese descent in southern China lack robust genetic evidence. Most African slaves in historical China were castrated, precluding reproduction. Any descendants would likely come from rare individuals who escaped castration, but tracking such lineages 1,000 plus years later is nearly impossible. Source citation, Wyatt, The Blacks of Pre-Modern China, pp. 201 to 215 Banks. So they were there, they served, they suffered, they were castrated, preventing descendants, and they vanished. Deuteronomy 28:64, And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, and there thou shalt serve other gods. Fulfilled in China, documented, and then erased from history. Banks shifts focus to Japan. Banks, now we move to Japan. Unlike China, where the African presence was primarily slaves, Japan has one very famous documented African individual, Yasuke, the Black Samurai. Riley, wait, there was a Black Samurai? There was. Let me show you the evidence. The Black Samurai, 1581 to 1582. Kafo Yasuke is the most documented African in Japanese history. He served under Oda Nobunaga, one of the most powerful daimyo, feudal lords, during Japan's Sengoku period. She projects historical images and modern artistic reconstructions of Yasuke. Still, his story shows Africans reached Japan, and we need to document it fully. Primary sources on Yasuke. Source 1. Jesuit records. Document. Letters from Jesuit missionaries in Japan, 1581 to 1582. Author Luis Frois, Portuguese Jesuit missionary. Letter excerpt, 1581. The black man whom the padre brought from India came into the presence of Nobunaga. He was a man of good stature and strength, and his skin was like black lacquer. Nobunaga was greatly pleased and wished to keep him. Source citation, Luis Frois, Letters and Historical Writings, compiled in Historia de Japan, History of Japan, written 1585-94, English excerpts in Thomas Lockley and Geoffrey Girard, African Samurai, The True Story of Yasuke, Hanover Square Press, 2019, pp 89-94. Original Portuguese documents archived at Arquivo Nacional Torre do Tombo, Lisbon Banks. So Jesuits brought an African man to Japan. He was presented to Nobunaga, who was so impressed he kept him in his service. Source 2. Japanese Historical Records document, Shinchoko Kiko-ji, Chronicle of Lord Nobunaga. Author Otaguichi, Taithin Yoit, 1527-1613, Nobunaga's retainer. Description. official chronicle of Oda Nobunaga's life and campaigns. Contains one of the only Japanese primary source mentions of Yasuke. Entry 1581, translated, a black man was brought to the Lord. His height was 6 shaku 2 sun, approximately 6 pu 2. His body was black like ink. The Lord had him stripped from the waist up and had him washed, thinking the black might be paint, but it did not come off. Source citation, Otagyuichi Shincho Koki, circa 1610, modern Japanese edition, Kadokawa Shoten, Tokyo, multiple editions. English translation excerpts in Lockley and Girard, African Samurai, pp. 102-105. Also discussed in Yeron Lammers, Japonius Tyrannus, the Japanese warlord, Oda Nobunaga Reconsidered, Hote Publishing, 2000. Chen Nobunaga thought his skin was painted and tried to wash it off. When it didn't come off, he realized the man was naturally black. Source 3. Yasuke's role as samurai. Okafor Yasuke wasn't just a curiosity. Nobunaga gave him the status of samurai, a weapon-bearer and retainer. This was extraordinary. Evidence. Given a stipend. Japanese records indicate Nobunaga gave Yasuke a stipend and a residence, standard for samurai retainers. 2. Given a Japanese name. Yasuke was the name Nobunaga bestowed. His original name is unknown. 3. Carried Nobunaga's weapons, a role reserved for trusted samurai. 4. Fought in battles, present during Nobunaga's campaigns, including the Honnoji incident, 1582, where Nobunaga was betrayed and killed. Source: Thomas Lockley and Geoffrey Girard, African Samurai, The True Story of Yasuke, a Legendary Black Warrior in Feudal Japan, Hanover Square Press, 2019. Most comprehensive modern research on Yasuke, synthesizes Japanese and Jesuit sources. ISBN 978-133582965. Jeroen Lammers, Japonius Tyrannus, The Japanese Warlord, Oda Nobunaga Reconsidered, Hote Publishing, 2000. Academic study of Nobunaga, includes discussion of Yasuke. ISBN 978-9074822138. Yasuke's origin, Riley. Where did Yasuke come from? Okafor. The sources say he was brought from India by the Jesuits, but that likely means he was in India when acquired by the Portuguese, not that he was Indian. Most likely origin. 1. Mozambique, Portuguese colony in East Africa. Portuguese had extensive slave operations there, brought Africans to their trading posts in India, Goa. Jesuits operated in both Mozambique and India. 2. Ethiopia. Some scholars argue his height, 6'2", very tall for the time, and descriptions suggest Ethiopian origin. Ethiopia had contact with Portuguese. Source: Thomas Lockley, historian, expert on Yasuke. Analysis: Yasuke was likely from Mozambique, brought to India by Portuguese traders, where he entered the service of the Jesuit mission. From India he accompanied Alessandro Valignano, Jesuit inspector, to Japan in 1579. His exact ethnic origin within East Africa remains uncertain. Source citation: Lockley and Girard, African Samurai, pp. 45-58, 255-260. Also Thomas Lockley, The Story of Yasuke, Nobunaga's African Retainer, Journal of African Cultural Studies, Vol. 31, No. 3, 2019. Banks. So Yasuke was East African, Mozambique, or possibly Ethiopia, brought to India via Portuguese slave routes, then brought to Japan by Jesuits. Okafor. Correct. And while he wasn't likely an Israelite, his presence proves Africans reached Japan. And if one African reached Japan via Portuguese routes in the 1500s, could others have arrived earlier via different routes? Other Africans in Japan? Chen. Were there other Africans in Japan besides Yasuke? Banks. Let's investigate. Nanban Trade, Southern Barbarian Trade, 1540-1639. The Nanban Trade period is when Portuguese and Spanish traders had extensive contact with Japan. They brought goods, religion, Christianity, and people. Okafor. Portuguese traders used African slaves on their ships and in their trading posts. Some of these Africans would have set foot in Japanese ports. Source: Charles Ralph Boxer. The Christian Century in Japan, 1549-1650, 1951. Description: standard academic work on Portuguese-Spanish presence in Japan. Documents that Portuguese ships visiting Japanese ports, Nagasaki, Hirada, had African slaves aboard as crew and servants. Quote, the Portuguese carracks arriving at Nagasaki often carried mixed crews, including African slaves. Servants and seamen, many of whom were seen by the Japanese as curious foreign southern men with black skin. Some were sold or gifted as servants to local Japanese lords. Source citation: Charles Ralph Boxer, The Christian Century in Japan, 1549 to 1650. University of California Press, 1951, pp. 107 to 110. ISBN 978-052015554 Chen. So Africans, mostly enslaved by the Portuguese, were physically present in Japanese ports during the 1500s to 1600s. Banks meaning. Yasuke wasn't necessarily the only one, just the most famous and best document these records of black foreigners. There are a few scattered Japanese records referencing dark-skinned foreigners prior to Yasuke. Example, some 16th century Japanese texts use the term kokujin, kuren literally black person, to describe African or dark-skinned foreign visitors. Example, 1560s, Diary of Ashikaga Yoshiteru references a black-skinned man among the southern traders. Source citation: Ashikaga Yoshiteru, Shogun 1536 to 1565, diary excerpts, discussed in Lockley and Gerard, African Samurai, pp. 61 to 64. Also in Boxer, The Christian Century in Japan, pp. 108 to 109. Banks. So by the mid-1500s, Japan had already seen African visitors, sailors, traders, slaves or servants, decades before Yasuke arrived. Religious context: serving other gods, Riley, and if any of these Africans were Israelites, they would have ended up serving foreign gods too, Shinto, Buddhism, or even Catholicism. Exactly. And Japan, during the 1500s, was a battleground of religions, traditional Shinto, Buddhism, and the new wave of Catholicism brought by Jesuits. Okafor. So if Israelites were among these Africans, they were again fulfilling Deuteronomy 28 verse 64, serving gods unknown to their fathers. African DNA in modern Japan? Chen genetic studies in Japan haven't identified any trace of African ancestry in modern Japanese populations, which suggests that if Africans lived there, they left little to no genetic legacy, either due to isolation, death, or assimilation. Source: Human Genetic Diversity in East Asia, Nature Genetics, Vol. 46, 2014, pp. 1221 to 1232. Genome-wide SNP data of the Japanese archipelago, American Journal of Human Genetics, 2017. If there were African lineages, they've either disappeared or are statistically negligible. Banks, same as China. They were scattered there, served and disappeared. Summary: Japan banks recapping. Africans documented in Japan, Yasuke 1581 to 1582. Portuguese and Jesuit slave trade connected to Japan. Multiple African individuals present via Nanban Trade. No surviving descendants identifiable today. Possible fulfillment of Deuteronomy 28:64 again. Scattered, serving other gods. Act 3. Korea. The Invisible Thread. Intel TD. Research Lab. Day Chen scrolls through Korean archives on her monitor. Now for Korea. Much harder to find evidence. There's very little direct documentation of Africans or Israelites there before the modern era, but there are indirect traces. Such as Korea. During Tang and Song dynasties. Chen Korea, then the kingdoms of Silla, Goryeo and later Joseon, was deeply connected to China, tributary relationships, cultural exchange and migration. If Africans were present in China, especially in Tang and Song courts, some could have arrived in Korea through diplomatic or slave exchanges. Source: Samguk Sagi, Chronicles of the Three Kingdoms, 1145 AD, Goryeosa, Goli, History of Goryeo, 1451 AD. Neither explicitly mention Africans, but both record numerous foreign envoys and servants from the western regions, Shiyu, and southern seas, Nanhai. Interpretation: some historians propose that these vague terms could occasionally refer to dark-skinned foreigners, including Africans, though this remains speculative. Source citation: Goryeosa, compiled 1451, ed. Kim Jo, translation and analysis in Martina Deutler, The Confucian Transformation of Korea, Harvard University Press, 1992, pp. 47 to 49. Trade routes reaching the Korean peninsula. Okafor Tang-era maritime routes connected Guangzhou, China, Shandong, Korea's southern ports, e.g. Guangzhou, Busan. If African slaves were transported to Guangzhou, they could have been redistributed or transferred through these networks. Source: Kenneth R. Robinson, Maritime Relations of Korea and China During the Tang-Song Transition, Korean Studies, Vol. 27, 2003, pp. 57 to 88. Chen, no direct mention of Africans in Korea, but the trade and tributary systems made it possible. Modern genetic evidence. None. Riley. So no African genetic traces in Korea either? Chen, undetectable. Modern genome studies of Korean populations show no African admixture prior to modern times. Source: Population structure of Koreans revealed by whole genome analysis, BMC Genomics, 2020. Banks. So Korea fits the same pattern, scattered possibly there, but erased by time and assimilation. Deuteronomy connection. Again, Banks' Deuteronomy 28 doesn't say Israel would remain identifiable in all lands, only that they'd be scattered among all peoples and serve foreign gods. That can include complete cultural erasure. Okafor. And East Asia fits that perfectly. Presence documented, faith erased, legacy lost. Banks. China, Japan, Korea all show the pattern of scattering, servitude, and disappearance. The team gathers around the glowing map table, showing lines from East Africa to Arabia, India, China, Japan, and Korea. Banks. So let's map the full route of scattering into East Asia. Chen starting point, East Africa, the Zanj coast, modern Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique. Okafor from there, captives were taken by Arab traders across the Indian Ocean to Arabia, India, and Southeast Asia. Riley. Then sold again, from India or Southeast Asia into China, then to Korea or Japan through secondary trade. Banks, and that fulfills Deuteronomy 28 verse 64, from one end of the earth to the other, Africa to East Asia. She marks it on the map, the line crosses half the world. Reviewing prophecy alignments. Banks. Let's compare what we've found to specific prophecies in Deuteronomy 28. Prophecy, description, fulfillment in East Asia. V. Skolmel, 64. Scattered among all people, from one end of the earth even unto the other. Africans, some Israelites, documented in China, Japan, Korea. 68. Brought into Egypt, bondage by ships. Indian Ocean slave trade routes by ship. V. 33. The fruit of thy land. Shall a nation which thou knowest not eat up. Chinese, Arab, and other nations benefiting from slave labour. V. 48. In hunger, in thirst, in nakedness, he shall put a yoke of iron upon thy neck. Enslavement and castration of African men in Tang-era China. Serve other gods, wood and stone. Forced servitude in Buddhist and Taoist households. Riley, every element matches. And this diaspora wasn't just trade. It was a scattering without return. The forgotten diaspora concept. Banks historians talk about the transatlantic slave trade, the trans-Saharan slave trade, and the Indian Ocean trade, but nobody connects the East Asian leg as part of the same global scattering. Chen, because it didn't leave visible descendants. No modern black population in China or Japan means it was easy to erase from collective memory. Okafor, but archaeologically and textually, it's there. Kunlun slaves, Tang Dynasty figurines, Jesuit records, Zhenghe's voyages, Yasuke, it's all connected. Scholarly corroboration. Banks. Let's list the scholars and works that verify African presence in East Asia. Chen. 1. Edward H. Schaefer, The Golden Peaches of Samarkand, 1963, The Black Man in Tang China, 1965. 2. Don J. Wyatt, The Blacks of Pre-Modern China, 2010. 3. Tansen Sen, Buddhism, Diplomacy and Trade, 2003. 4. Louise Levath's When China Ruled the Seas, 1994. 5. Thomas Lockley and Geoffrey Girard, African Samurai, 2019. 6. Charles R. Boxer, The Christian Century in Japan, 1951. 7. Hugh R. Clark, Community Trade and Networks, 1991. 8. Kenneth R. Robinson, Maritime Relations of Korea and China During the Tang Transition, 2003. Chen. Every one of these provides verifiable academic sources confirming African individuals and communities in East Asia across different centuries. Deeper connection. The name Kunlun. Riley. But what does Kunlun really mean? Okafor, that's another clue. The word Kunlun originally referred to mythic western mountains, possibly the Hindu Kush. Later it became a term for dark-skinned foreigners. Banks. So the term itself encodes geographic direction, from the west, and complexion, dark. Okafor, exactly. It's like how Ethiopian once meant burnt face in Greek. Kunlun meant dark people from the far west or south. Source: Don J. Wyatt, The Blacks of Pre-Modern China, pp. 12-14. Edward Schaefer, The Golden Peaches of Samarkand, 2021. Riley. So even linguistically, Chinese recognized Africans as people from the mountains of the west. Banks, which would fit Israelites who migrated or were taken eastward from Africa. Intercultural contacts, evidence beyond slavery. Chen, there's also evidence of Africans who weren't slaves, merchants, envoys, or sailors. Example, African or South Asian sailors known as Zhengjiao Ren in Song-era maritime records, described as dark-skinned navigators or traders from Western oceans. Source, Angela Schottenhammer, The East Asian Mediterranean, Emporia Networks in China's South Coastal Seas, Journal of Asian History, Vol 40, 2006. So not all Africans in China were slaves, some were part of trade crews. Banks, meaning Israelites could have arrived both through forced migration and voluntary trade. The prophecy doesn't limit the means, it only describes the outcome, scattering and servitude. Riley, it's eerie. Every time we think the pattern stops, it shows up again. Different land, same prophecy. Banks, that's the point. The scattering was global, and East Asia is the missing piece, historians never connected. Act 5, The Reckoning Int. SLD, conference room night, a single light over the table. Maps of ancient Asia spread out. Banks stands at the head, voice low but resolute. Banks, we've documented Israelite presence in West Africa, transatlantic trade, North Africa and the Middle East, Roman dispersions, Central and East Africa, Arab slave routes, India, Cochin and Bene Israel communities, East Asia, Kunlun slaves, Yasuke and He's captives. That's from one end of the earth, even unto the other. Riley. And every place, the same conditions, slavery, loss of heritage, forced religion. Okafor, everywhere they went, they served nations that didn't know their God. Chen, most of the world has forgotten they were ever there. Banks, but prophecy didn't say the world would remember. It said they'd be scattered, forgotten, until the awakening. Documented summary, East Asian diaspora, region, time period, primary sources, nature of presence, until the awakening. China, Tang Song dynasties, 7th-13th C. Taiping Guangzhou, Xintang Shu, Tang figurines, Shafa, 1963, Wyatt, 2010, enslaved Africans, Kunlun slaves, castrated servants, minor merchants. Japan, 16th C, Nanban Trade era, Jesuit letters, Shinchoku-ki, Boxer, 1951, Lockley and Gerard, 2019, Africans via Portuguese ship slave servants, Yasuke samurai. Korea, Tang Joseon periods, Goriosa, Doikla, 1992, Robinson, 2003, possible indirect transfer via China, undocumented individuals. East African source, 7th to 15th C, Arab slave trade records, Shafa, 1965, Sen, Zanj peoples taken via Indian Ocean to Asia. Modern implications. Banks, this changes the narrative. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't the only fulfillment of Deuteronomy 28. There were multiple routes, and the East Asian route proves the global scale of the scattering. Okafor. And every route led to nations worshipping wood and stone, Buddhist idols, Hindu icons, Catholic statues. Chen. And yet, the people who lived through it left almost no trace. The prophecy of erasure itself fulfilled. Riley, they weren't just scattered, they were silenced. Int. Closing monologue Banks. They call it history. We call it prophecy fulfilled. From Jerusalem to Kush, from the Horn of Africa to Guangzhou, from the Indian Ocean to Kyoto, everywhere the Israelites went, they served, suffered, and vanished from memory until now. Because remembering them isn't just history, it's justice. Text on screen. Open quote. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people, from the one end of the earth, even unto the other end of the earth. Deuteronomy 28, verse 64. Close quote. Roll credits. SLTD, Special Series Episode 3, East Asia, The Forgotten Diaspora. Written by Sarah Banks, Riley Thompson, Okafor Chen. Research consultants Don J. Wyatt, Edward H. Schaffer, Thomas Lockley, Louise Levaths. Produced by SALTD, Investigations, all rights reserved. Africans, possibly including Israelites, were present in East Asia from approximately 600 to 1600s AD, brought via Arab slave trade and Portuguese colonial routes. China, documented evidence, Tang Dynasty, 6 to 907 AD. Kunlun slaves, Kunlunu, dark-skinned people from Southeast Asia and East Africa. Hundreds of ceramic figurines depicting African features found in Tang tombs. Historical texts explicitly reference Kunlun slaves in elite households. Tang Dynasty poetry mentions dark-skinned servants. Primary sources, Taiping Guangzhou, Taiping Guangdan 78 AD, contains Tang Dynasty stories of Kunlun slaves. Tang Dynasty tomb excavations, hundreds of figurines, Shanxi History Museum, Xi'an, National Museum of China, Beijing. Tang Dynasty poetry, various poets reference dark-skinned servants. How they arrived. Arab slave trade via Indian Ocean, Southeast Asian ports, Guangzhou, Canton. Peak period 700s to 800s AD, overlapping with Arab Islamic expansion into East Africa. Maritime trade between Arab-Persian merchants and Chinese ports well documented. Treatment. Castrated upon arrival or shortly after. Documented practice. Served as slaves, servants in wealthy Chinese households. No reproductive capacity equals no descendants. Genetic line deliberately cut. Song Dynasty, 960 to 1279 AD, continued references to Kunlun people in Chinese texts. Lingwai Daida, 1178 AD by Zhou Kefei, describes dark-skinned peoples from southern seas. Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644 AD. Zheng He's naval expeditions, 1405 to 1433 AD, reached East African coast, Mogadishu, Malindi, brought back people, animals, goods as tribute to Ming Emperor. What happened to them? Castration practice prevented descendants. Those who weren't castrated likely assimilated over generations. By 1500s to 1600s, African presence largely disappeared from records. No known modern descendants. Japan, documented evidence. Yasuke, samurai, 1581 to 1580, only documented African samurai in Japanese history. Served Oda Nobunaga, one of Japan's most powerful warlords. Given samurai status, stipend, residence, Japanese name. Fought in battles alongside Nobunaga. Primary sources. Jesuit letters from Lufro 1581 to 1582, Portuguese missionary accounts, Shinchogaki, Chronicle of Lord Nobunaga. Byota Guichi, circa 1610. Both sources describe Yasuke's height, 6'2" Mick, appearance, black like ink, and service. Origin, likely from Mozambique or Ethiopia, Portuguese East African colonies, brought to India by Portuguese traders, accompanied Jesuit mission to Japan, 1579, presented to Nobunaga, 1581. Fate, Nobunaga killed in Honnoji incident, June 1582. Yasuke captured by enemy forces, turned over to Jesuits, disappears from historical record after 1582. Fate unknown, possibly returned to India, possibly remained in Japan, possibly died. No known descendants. Other Africans in Japan. Nanban Trade period, 1543 to 1639, Portuguese-Spanish contact with Japan. Portuguese ships had African slaves as crew servants, some depicted in Japanese Nanban art, folding screens. No permanent African settlement. 1639, Japan expelled Portuguese. Closed borders. Any Africans would have been expelled or died without descendants. Korea, insufficient evidence, possible but unverified. Dutch East India Company ships with potential African crew reached Korean waters 1600s. Japanese invasions of Korea 1592-1598 may have included African retainers in Japanese forces. Korean diplomats visiting Chinese courts may have encountered Africans. Status: no primary sources found in available Korean, Dutch or Japanese records. Absence of evidence, evidence of absence. Cannot make definitive claims without documentation. Were they Israelites? Evidence suggesting some may have been. Timing: Tang Dynasty peak, 700s to 900s AD. Overlaps with Arab slave trade expansion into East Africa. Source regions: Arab slave trade primarily sourced from East Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, Mozambique, Somalia, Ethiopia. These regions had documented Hebrew Israelite populations. Beta Israel, Ethiopia. Lemba, southern East Africa. Other Hebraic communities. Arab trade routes connected East Africa, Arabia, Persia, India, Southeast Asia, China. Statistical probability: if Arab slavers captured people indiscriminately from East African regions with Hebrew populations, some captives would have been Israelites. Cannot definitively prove. Chinese texts don't distinguish between African ethnic groups, all called Kunlun. No written records from the slaves themselves. DNA evidence impossible. Castration prevented descendants. No identified skeletal remains. Percentage unknown. Conclusion: plausible and likely that some Africans brought to China and Japan were from Israelite Hebrew populations, but not definitively proven. Deuteronomy 28:64 fulfillment. Deuteronomy 28:64 KJV. And the Lord shall scatter thee among all people from the one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth, And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. Fulfillment in East Asia. Scatter thee among all people. China, Tang, Song, Ming dynasties, 600s to 1400s AD. Japan, Nanban period, 1543 to 1639, including Yasuke, 1581 to 1582. From one end of the earth to the other. East Africa, Ethiopia, Mozambique, East Asia, China, Japan. Literally opposite ends of the known world. Serve other gods, wood and stone. China, Buddhism, Taoism, extensive use of wooden and stone idols in temples. Japan, Buddhism, Shinto, wooden shrines, stone statues. Neither Israelites nor their fathers knew these religions. The prophecy fits the historical evidence. Primary sources cited: Chinese sources, Taiping Guangji, 1970 AD, extensive records of the Taiping era. Xintangshu, 1060 AD, New Book of Tang, Lingwai Daida, 1178 AD, by Zhou Qufei. Song Dynasty Geographical Work, Tang Dynasty Tomb Excavations, 1950s present, Shanxi Provincial Institute of Archaeology, Tang Dynasty Poetry, various poets. Japanese sources, Shincho Koki, Shinchan Kongji, circa 1610, by Ota Guichi, Chronicle of Lord Nobunaga, Jesuit letters from Louis Frois, 1581 to 1582, Nanban screens, Nanban Pingfen, late 1500s, early 1600s. Japanese folding screen paintings. Korean sources, Hamel's Journal, 1668, by Hendrik Hamel, Dutch shipwreck account, Korean historical texts searched, Sagi, Goryo-sa, Joseon Wangzhou Silok, no explicit mentions found. Modern scholarship. Don J. Wyatt, The Blacks of Pre-Modern China, University of Pennsylvania Press, 2010, definitive academic work. Edward H. Schaffer, The Golden Peaches of Samarkand, UC Press, 1963. Edward H. Schaffer, The Black Man in Tang, China, Journal of the American Oriental Society, 1965. Thomas Lockley and Jeffrey Girard, African Samurai, The True Story of Yasuke, Hanover Square Press, 2019. Charles Ralph Boxer, The Christian Century in Japan, 1549 to 1650, UC Press, 1951. Louise Levithers, When China Ruled the Seas, Simon & Schuster, 1994. Tansen Sen, Buddhism, Diplomacy and Trade, University of Hawaii Press, 2003. Archives, Shanxi History Museum, Xi'an, Tang Dynasty Figurines, National Museum of China, Beijing Tang Dynasty Figurines, Tokyo National Museum, Nanban Art, Arquivo Nacional Torre do Tombo, Lisbon, Jesuit letters. Key findings. 1. Africans were present in China for 700 plus years, 600s to 1300s AD. 2. Brought via Arab slave trade, Indian Ocean routes. 3. Castrated to prevent reproduction, no descendants. 4. Served in elite Chinese households. 5. Evidence suggests some may have been Israelites from East African Hebrew populations. 6. Yasuke, the only documented African samurai, served in Japan 1581 to 1582. All eventually disappeared, erased through castration and lack of documentation. 8. Deuteronomy 28 verse 64 fulfilled, scattered to opposite ends of earth, served foreign gods of wood and stone. This is the forgotten diaspora. Scattered, enslaved, castrated, erased, but documented and now remembered.